All right, today we're going to take a look. We're going to continue on with our section on the lead into the Revolutionary War. And today we're going to take a look at how colonial resistance has grown in the colonies. I want to read you a little bit about this man right here. His name's Crispus Attucks, and he knew about the struggle for freedom. He was a man that was a son of an African American father and a Native American mother. He was born into slavery in Framingham, Massachusetts around 1723. And as a young man, Attucks escaped by running away to sea, and he spent the next 20 years as a sailor working on whaling boats. To avoid recapture, he used a false name, calling himself Michael Johnson. Then in March of 1770, Attucks found himself in Boston, where feelings against British rule were reaching a fever pitch. The words freedom and liberty seemed to be on everyone's lips, and one night Attucks heard about a disturbance involving colonists and British troops, and he decided to investigate. He had no idea that he was about to play a key role in American history, which would be losing his life to a bullet in a protest that came to be known as the Boston Massacre. In this section, we're going to take a look at how the tension between Britain and its colonies led to a lot of violence. Now, your learning targets for this section, by the end, you should be able to explain the Townshend Acts. You should be able to describe why and how the colonists protested the Townshend Acts. You should be able to explain the Boston Massacre, and you should be able to summarize the Tea Act and the Boston Tea Party. So, moving on. Now, like we talked about Crispus Attucks, he is a vocabulary term in this section, and he will be on your test. So, make sure that you know that he is the focus of the Boston Massacre. But moving on to the Townshend Acts, after the uproar over the Stamp Act, Britain hoped to avoid further conflict. Even so, it still needed to raise money to pay for troops and other expenses in America. The Quartering Act, which we talked about last section, was not working. Most of the British Army was in New York, and New York saw that as an unfair burden. Its assembly refused to pay to house the troops because they did not want them there in the first place. The King's finance minister, Charles Townshend, told Parliament that he had a way to raise revenue in the colonies. So in 1767, Parliament passed his plan known as the Townshend Acts. That's Charles Townshend right there. Now, the first of the Townshend Acts suspended New York's assembly until New Yorkers agreed to provide housing for the troops. The other acts placed duties or import taxes on various goods brought into the colonies like glass, paper, paint, lead, and tea. Townshend thought that duties which were collected before the goods entered the colonies would anger the colonists less than the direct taxes of the Stamp Act. Now, the money that was raised with these duties or taxes would be used to pay the salaries of British governors and other officials in the colonies. So to enforce the act, British officers used what was called the writs of assistance. It's a fancy word for a search warrant to enforce the acts. They would actually enter the homes or businesses and search for smuggled goods. Here on the right you can see last section we talked about James Otis and how he was a colonist who kind of fanned the flames of protest a little bit, and here's his speech against the writs of assistance. This is an actual primary source document. Now, protests immediately broke out all over the colonies at the news of the Townshend Acts. New Yorkers were mad that their elected assembly had been suspended. People throughout the colonies were upset that Britain was placing new taxes on them. John Dickinson, an important Pennsylvania lawyer, said the issue is whether Parliament can legally take money out of our pockets without our consent. He explained his opposition to Townshend Acts in essays called Letters from a Farmer in Pennsylvania, which was published in 1767. And he actually said, "Let these truths be impressed on our minds that we cannot be happy without being free, that we cannot be free without being secure in our property, that we cannot be secure in our property without our consent others may take it away, that taxes imposed on us by Parliament do thus take it away, that duties laid for the sole purpose of raising money are taxes, that attempts to lay such duties should be instantly and firmly opposed." Now, the colonists were also angry about the writs of assistance. Many believed, like James Otis had argued, that the writs went against their natural rights. These rights had been described by English philosopher John Locke during the Enlightenment. The law of nature, said Locke, teaches that no one ought to harm another in his life, health, liberty, or possessions. The colonists felt that the Townshend Acts were a serious threat to their rights and freedoms. Now, to protest the Townshend Acts, colonists in Boston announced another boycott of British goods in October of 1767. The driving force behind this protest was Samuel Adams, who was a leader of the Boston Sons of Liberty. Adams urged colonists to continue to resist British controls, and that's Adams right here, and yes, he is more than just a beer. That's how most of you probably know him from commercials, but he was a very influential person in the Revolution. The boycott spread throughout the colonies, and the Sons of Liberty pressured shopkeepers not to sell imported goods. The Daughters of Liberty called on colonists to weave their own cloth and use American products. So as a result, trade with Britain fell very sharply. Now, colonial leaders asked for peaceful protests as well. Articles in the Boston Gazette asked the people to remain calm, and they said, quote, "No mobs, constitutional methods are best," end quote. However, tempers were running very, very high. When customs officers in Boston tried to seize the American merchant ship Liberty, which was carrying smuggled wine, a riot broke out. The rioters often forced the customs officials to flee. So, fearing a loss of control, officials called for more British troops. And a defiant Samuel Adams replied, "We will destroy every soldier that dares put his foot on shore. I look upon them as foreign enemies." So, quite an interesting take there. It's basically a full-out threat. So tensions are running very, very high, and things are not going very well in the colonies right now between the British and the colonists. Now, in the fall of 1768, 1,000 British soldiers, known as Redcoats for their bright red jackets, arrived in Boston under the command of General Thomas Gage. With their arrival, tension filled the streets of Boston. Since the soldiers were poorly paid, they often hired themselves out as workers, usually at rates lower than those of American colonists. So resentment against the Redcoats grew. Soldiers and street youths often yelled insults at each other. They'd yell, "Lobsters for sale," the youth would yell, referring to the Redcoats. And Yankees, the soldiers would jeer back. And Yankee was supposed to be an insult, but the colonists took pride in the name. Now, on March 5th of 1770, tensions finally exploded into violence. A group of youth and dock workers, which were Redcoats that were hired out, among them Crispus Attucks of the youth, they started trading insults in front of the custom house. We had a fight break out, and the soldiers began firing, and Attucks and 4 laborers were killed. The Sons of Liberty called the shooting the Boston Massacre, and they said that Attucks and the 4 others had given their lives for freedom. The incident quickly became a tool for British propaganda, which we'll talk about in the next slide. But I want to show you here in this picture. This big picture here is actually an engraving done by Paul Revere. It's his famous Boston Massacre engraving, and it's not very accurate. The work here that you see only depicts 7 redcoats firing, when in actuality there were 8 that were charged. Furthermore, Crispus Attucks, obviously he's a black man. You don't see him in the engraving. And Revere's claim as actually being the artist of the engraving is a bit misleading, because Revere pretty much copied it bit by bit from a piece done by a guy named Henry Pelham, and he rushed his work to the public ahead of Pelham's, and by the time Pelham could protest, Revere's famous engraving was now going up on walls throughout Boston. So up here, right, this is the original from Pelham, and this is Paul Revere's engraving. So if you want to pause and take a look, I know the one picture is kind of small, but you can see just how close these two renderings are to each other. Moving on, but so once again, the Sons of Liberty called this shooting the Boston Massacre, and they said that Attucks and the 4 others gave their lives for freedom. It was definitely a tool that was used for anti-British propaganda. Now, what was interesting is that right away these British redcoats were arrested for murder, and they were defended by John Adams. Interestingly enough, he is the lawyer and a cousin of Samuel Adams. So we got one of the leaders of the Boston Sons of Liberty, his own relative, is defending these redcoats. And John Adams was heavily criticized for taking on this case and defending the redcoats, but he wanted to show that the colonists could, follow the rule of law. And he actually said that we should be deaf to the clamors of the populace. He actually did support the colonial cause in this whole deal, but he wanted people to know that we did follow rules and we weren't just a bunch of barbarians, and we would be disciplined enough to do what was right. So Adams argued that the soldiers acted in self-defense. The jury agreed with them, and all of the redcoats were let go. But the damage had been done in the court of public opinion, and the Boston Massacre would stand forever as a symbol of British tyranny in Boston. Now, the colonists are totally unaware, but on the same day of the Boston Massacre, Parliament proposed the repeal of the Townshend Acts. 1 month later, all the acts except the tax on tea were repealed. The colonial boycott had been very effective. British trade had been hurt, and Parliament kept the tea tax just to show that it still had the right to tax the colonists. So for most Americans, the crisis was over. However, Samuel Adams wanted to make sure people did not forget the cause for liberty. So he started a drive to form committees of correspondence in various towns in Massachusetts. These groups exchanged letters and ideas on colonial affairs, and before long, committees throughout Massachusetts were corresponding with one another and with committees in other colonies. Then in 1773, Parliament opened up old wounds when it passed the Tea Act. Tea was very popular in the colonies, but much of it was smuggled in from Holland. The Tea Act gave the British East India Company control over the American tea trade. So the tea would arrive in the colonies only in the trading company's ships and be sold there by its merchants. So colonists who had not been paying any tax on smuggled tea would now have to pay a tax on this regulated tea, which made colonial shippers and merchants very, very mad, and it made the average colonist very upset too, because they now had to pay for something that they didn't have to pay for before. So the colonists in America were really wondering, what would Parliament do next? So protests against the Tea Act took place all over the colonies. In Charleston, South Carolina, colonists unloaded tea and let it rot on the docks. In New York City, Philadelphia, colonists blocked tea ships from landing. And in Boston, the Sons of Liberty organized what came to be known as the Boston Tea Party, which I think some of you have some prior knowledge of. So what had happened was, on the evening of December 16th of 1773, a group of men disguised as Native Americans boarded 3 tea ships docked in Boston Harbor. One of the men, George Hughes, a Boston shoemaker, later recalled the events, and he says in his own book, "We then were ordered by our commander to open the hatches and take out all the chests of tea and throw them overboard. In about 3 hours from the time we went on board, we had thus broken and thrown overboard every tea chest to be found in the ship, while those in the other ships were disposing of the tea in the same way at the same time." Now that night, Hughes and the others destroyed 342 chests of tea. A lot of colonists were very happy with the news, and they believed that Britain would now see how strongly colonists opposed taxation without representation. There were others that doubted that destroying property was the best way to settle the tax debate. Some colonial leaders offered to pay for the tea if Parliament would repeal the Tea Act, but Britain rejected the offer. In a sense, they wanted blood. They not only wanted repayment, but they also wanted the men who destroyed the tea to be brought to trial. The only problem was these men are disguised as Native Americans. They don't actually know who they were, and it's widely believed that these men acted in secret. They just knew where to meet. They met, they went and did their thing, and they left. They didn't ask any questions. They didn't even know who they were doing it with. They were just a collection of individuals. So the British reaction to this, we'll talk about in the next section, it really does fan the flames of rebellion in the 13 colonies. So hopefully you enjoyed this one, and we will have 2 assignments for you tomorrow, one guided reading and one on why protests can be an effective tool when used correctly. So have a good one.